All right. Well, Clara Barton became one of the most famous and important women of the 19th century for her work as a Civil War nurse, working with the US government to found the Missing Soldiers Office, working to raise awareness of and create the American Red Cross, and educating the American public on first aid training. Barton played an important role in laying the foundation for the modern systems of nursing, emergency medicine, missing soldier organizations, and disaster relief, while also being a trailblazer for women's rights. In this talk, we'll more closely examine the life and legacy of Clara Barton. Clarissa Harlow Barton was born December 25th, 1821 in North Oxford, Massachusetts. While one of the things she's most famous for is her work as a nurse during the Civil War, she had no medical training at all. The closest she got to anything medical was when she was 10 years old. She helped nurse her brother back to health when he broke his arm after falling off a barn roof. To help her overcome her shyness, Barton's parents suggested that she become a teacher, which she did at age 17. Barton first taught in her hometown of North Oxford. In 1852, while she was teaching in New Jersey, she heard about the lack of public schools in Bordentown. She was contracted by the town and established one of the first free public schools in the state. The school was successful, and after a year, Barton had hired another woman to help teach over 600 students. Both women were making $250 a year, which is a lot of money for 1800s. This accomplishment compelled the town to raise nearly $4,000 for a new school building. Once it was completed, Barton was replaced as principal by a man elected by the school board. The board saw the position as head of a large institution to be unfitting for a woman. Barton was demoted to female assistant and worked in a harsh environment until she had a nervous breakdown along with other health ailments, and she quit, stating, "I shall never do a man's work for less than a man's pay." In 1854, after recovering from her illness, Barton decided to look for work in Washington, D.C., where she became one of the first female employees of the federal government, working as a clerk at the U.S. Patent Office. U.S. Patent Office, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., is now the National Portrait Gallery. Today, in 2024, women make up 47% of the federal workforce. This had to start somewhere, and started with Clara Barton. While at the Patent Office, Barton did receive equal pay to her male counterparts, but it was not widely advertised that a woman was working there. During the 6 years that she was in government service, not once was she included in the official roll sent annually to Congress. For 3 years, she received much abuse and slander from male clerks. Subsequently, under political opposition to women working in government offices, her position was reduced to that of copyist. And in 1858, under the administration of the new president, James Buchanan, who was a Democrat, she was fired because she was a Republican. That's the way things worked back then. Barton returned to Massachusetts and lived with relatives and friends until the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, when Barton was able to return to her job as a copyist at the Patent Office. It was at that time that she moved into the boarding house on 7th Street Northwest, which is actually a block away from the U.S. Patent Office. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. 1 week later, on April 19, 1861, the Pratt Street riot in Baltimore resulted in the first bloodshed of the American Civil War, when United States soldiers were attacked by Southern sympathizers as they attempted to change trains. The victims, members of the 6th Massachusetts Militia, were transported after the violence to the unfinished Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Barton and her sister had heard of the attack, and they went to the railroad station to meet the victims when they arrived. Barton quickly recognized them, as some of them had been her students back in Massachusetts. Barton, along with several other women, personally provided clothing, food, and supplies for the sick and wounded soldiers. The regiment was billeted in the Capitol building, which was still under construction, and Barton would often visit to read books and newspapers to them, write letters to their families for them, talk to them, and generally support them. It was this experience that caused her to identify herself with Army work and to begin her efforts collecting medical supplies for Union soldiers. After the first Battle of Bull Run or Manassas in July of 1861, the top floor of the patent office was turned into a hospital for wounded Union soldiers. Barton volunteered in her spare time, feeding and washing the patients and dispersing medicines. Barton placed an ad in a Massachusetts newspaper for supplies, and the response was so huge that her living quarters in her boarding house were filled, and she had to rent 3 warehouses to store the rest of the supplies. In early 1862, prior to distributing provisions directly onto the battlefield and gaining further support, Barton distributed supplies in Washington with the help of a few friends, despite opposition from the War Department and among Army field surgeons. In August of 1862, Barton finally gained permission from Quartermaster Daniel Rucker to work on the front lines. She also gained support from other prominent people who believed in her cause. These people became her patrons, and her most supportive was Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. Barton worked to distribute stores, clean field hospitals, apply dressings, and serve food to wounded soldiers in close proximity to several battles, including Cedar Mountain and Second Bull Run or Manassas. About this time, she wrote, "When our armies fought at Cedar Mountain, I broke the shackles and went into the field. 5 days and nights with 3 hours sleep, a narrow escape from capture, and some days of getting the wounded into hospitals at Washington. And if you chance to feel that the positions I occupied were rough and unseemly for a woman, I can only reply that they were rough and unseemly for men." Without volunteers like Barton, especially women volunteers, the military medical department at this time would have been overwhelmed. In September of 1862, Barton heard that the Confederate Army had invaded Maryland and that a battle was imminent near the town of Sharpsburg. She gathered 3 wagons full of supplies and drove them to the battlefield, arriving while the fighting was still going on. She arrived just in time, as surgeons had run out of bandages and were using corn husks in their place. Barton quickly set to work helping the wounded. At one point in the battle, she was holding a soldier in her arms to give him water, and a bullet passed through the sleeve of her dress, killing the soldier. In another instance, when a surgeon could not be found, Barton used her penknife to remove a bullet from a soldier's cheek. The first, but not the only time she would assist in a surgery. "I do not suppose a surgeon would have pronounced it a scientific operation," she said, "but that it was successful I dared to hope from the gratitude of my patient." An unusual incident supposedly also occurred the day after the battle, when Barton was asked by a Wisconsin surgeon to examine a wounded soldier who was refusing treatment. The story goes that Barton spoke with the soldier, who confessed to being a woman. Mary Galloway had disguised herself as a man in order to follow her lover into battle. She arrived on the battlefield during the fighting and was unable to find him. Galloway was shot in the neck and lay on the field for 36 hours before being found. According to the story, Barton later found Galloway's lover while she was visiting a hospital in nearby Frederick, which is where our museum is located. So we like this local story. The two were reunited and married, and supposedly named their daughter Clara after Barton. While this incident is mentioned in both Barton's official papers and the papers of the Wisconsin surgeon, No other evidence has been found to verify the story, but I'm working on trying to figure out if this was true or not by going through some local records here in Frederick. At Antietam, Barton earned the nickname the Angel of the Battlefield and started to gain a reputation as the soldier's friend. There is a monument to her on the battlefield today, as you can see in the photograph here. It has a red cross made from bricks taken from Barton's home in Massachusetts. Speaking of her commitment to being a nurse in the war after experiencing battle, Barton said, "I shall remain here while anyone remains and do whatever comes to my hand. I may be compelled to face danger, but never fear it. And while our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them." It's worth noting that Barton could not have gone out and done all of her important work without the help of Edward Shaw, this gentleman here. It was Shaw, who was Barton's landlord and co-worker at the patent office, who did her work for her so she could hold her job and collect a paycheck from the patent office while she was off working on the battlefields. So we can thank him for allowing her to continue her humanitarian work. Barton was also present at the devastating Union defeat at Fredericksburg, Virginia in December of 1862, helping the hundreds of Union soldiers who had been wounded in the many futile assaults on Murray's Heights. She worked for days without rest at the Chatham Manor Hospital. It is here that she met the famous poet Walt Whitman, who had been looking for his wounded brother. Inspired by Barton's devotion to the soldiers, Whitman decided to become a nurse as well, and after finding his brother and returning to Washington, D.C., he became a regular fixture at the hospitals there. Barton worked to exhaustion before finally heading back to Washington, where she describes her return to her boarding house. "I was home from Fredericksburg, and when there, for the first time, I looked at myself, shoeless, gloveless, ragged, and bloodstained. A new sense of desolation and pity, and sympathy and weariness, all blended, swept over me with irresistible force, and perfectly overpowered, I sank down and wept as I had never done." The photograph here of Barton's room in Washington, D.C. is taken, our museum runs the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office in Washington, D.C., where she boarded during the war and where she started the Missing Soldiers Office. And I took that photograph, and this is a picture of her bedroom. And whenever I go there, I often think of this quote and just imagine her just sitting in that room and having a breakdown from working so hard. Barton spent most of 1863 in South Carolina, where she helped nurse the wounded African-American troops of the famous 54th Massachusetts at the Battle of Fort Wagner. If you've ever seen the film Glory, that tells the story of this particular unit and their battle at Fort Wagner. From that moment, she became an advocate for African-American rights, saying, "I can never forget the patient bravery with which black soldiers endured their wounds received in the cruel assault upon Wagner, as hour after hour they lay in the wet sand just back of the growling guns, waiting their turn for the knife or the splint or the bandage." Barton's story would not be complete without a mention of one of her contemporaries, Dorothea Dix. Dix was an advocate for the mentally ill and fought for the reform of mental institutions prior to the Civil War. During the war, she founded the Women's Army Nursing Corps and was appointed superintendent of Army nurses by the Union Army. One of the most frequently asked questions by those studying Barton's life is, why did she not join up with Dix? In fact, Barton had worked with Dix to help care for the wounded at the Patent Office Hospital in Washington after the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. However, Dix was hostile to women who, in her view, were working outside of her authority. She did not approve of women like Barton, who wanted to work at the front. At the time she worked with Dix, Barton made no attempt to join Dix's nursing corps. Throughout her time in the field, Barton felt threatened by Dix, who she felt was trying to exert her authority. and to stop Barton's work. Needless to say, an independent woman like Barton was in direct conflict with an authoritarian like Dix. Despite this clash between two of the most influential women of the Civil War, Barton's wartime volunteer nurse work was just as important as Dix's, not only because Barton helped the military medical departments who were overwhelmed, but together with other people who served as nurses throughout the war, she helped set a precedent for nursing as a profession. She provided modern men and women alike a role model to look towards for a career path and show how they could help in times of crisis. Barton's humanitarian work did not stop in 1865 with the end of the Civil War. In her very visual role as the angel of the battlefield, she often received inquiries from family members looking for soldiers who had been declared missing. Seeing a great need, Barton worked together with the U.S. government to start the Missing Soldiers Office. She got President Abraham Lincoln's approval and eventually received $15,000 from Congress to officially work to find missing soldiers. And I love this photograph, this letter that she wrote. The penmanship is amazing. Her work initially began at a place called Camp Parole in Annapolis, Maryland, where she talked with newly returned prisoners of war to gather information about missing soldiers. While there, she received almost 400 letters a day from families around the country who knew of Clara Barton as the soldier's friend and sought her help in finding their loved ones. Eventually, she moved her operation back to her boarding house in Washington, where she officially established the Missing Soldiers Office. To get a soldier's name on the roll of missing men, family members or friends sent the soldier's name and regiment to Barton, who would record this information on a list. These rolls were then published in newspapers and posted in prominent places such as railroad stations and post offices. If someone recognized a name on the list and knew what happened to the soldier, they were then to write to Barton, and she would pass the information on to the soldier's next of kin. It was during this time that Barton was approached by a veteran Union soldier who had been a prisoner at the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia. Dorrance Atwater had been in charge of the burial details at the prison and had secretly kept a list of names of all the deceased soldiers and where they had been buried. Hearing of Barton's efforts to locate missing soldiers, he approached her and asked for her assistance in marking the graves at Andersonville. Barton agreed to help and traveled with Atwater to Georgia. Together, they were able to identify and mark the graves of 13,000 soldiers who had been prisoners at Andersonville, and they also officially established the National Cemetery there. Barton was given the honor of raising the American flag at the dedication ceremony. From 1865 to 1868, Barton, with a small team of clerks, exchanged over 60,000 letters and found the final resting place for over 22,000 missing soldiers. Barton achieved widespread recognition from 1865 to 1868 by delivering lectures around the country about her war experiences. On occasion, she would partner with her good friend Dorrance Atwater to tell their story of identifying the dead at Andersonville. The money that Barton raised from her lectures was used to fund the Missing Soldiers Office. During this time, Barton met suffragist Susan B. Anthony and began an association with the women's suffrage movement, sometimes sharing the lecture platform with other women's rights advocates. She also became acquainted with the famous African-American activist Frederick Douglass and became an advocate for civil rights. Her strong belief that African-American men deserved to gain the right to vote before women led to a rift between many of the suffragettes, with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton going against Barton. Barton explained her position by stating, "No person would be more rejoiced than I to see the franchise bestowed upon every person capable of using it without regard to race, color, or sex. But if the door was not wide enough for all at once, and one must wait or all must wait, then I for one am willing that the old scarred slave limp through before me. After completing her final lecture tour in 1868, Barton closed the missing soldiers' office, as most of the sources of information on missing soldiers had been depleted. Suffering from exhaustion and close to a mental breakdown, Barton took the advice of a friend and went on vacation to Switzerland. But as we all know, Barton really was not one to take a vacation. She was always looking for something to do and usually ended up doing some more work. So while in Geneva, she was approached by representatives of the International Red Cross, who had heard of her work and wanted to know why the US hadn't signed on to the Geneva Convention the previous 3 times the government had been asked. The convention was an international agreement governing the status and treatment of captured and wounded military personnel and civilians in wartime. It also provided for the neutrality of both relief workers and the wounded themselves. Barton had never heard about this and was amazed by the story they told, but it would be a while before she took concrete action to bring the Red Cross to the United States. In the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, she assisted the Grand Duchess of Baden in the preparation of military hospitals and gave the International Red Cross Society much aid during the war. At the joint request of German authorities, she superintended the supplying of work to the poor of Strasbourg in 1871, after the siege of Paris, and had charge of the public distribution of supplies to the destitute people of Paris. At the close of the war, she received honorable decorations of the Golden Cross of Baden and the Prussian Iron Cross. As Barton returned to good health in 1877, she longed for humanitarian work again and thought of the International Red Cross. In 1877, Russia and Turkey went to war with each other, which inspired her to work to create a Red Cross Society in America where people could send donations to help people caught up in the war. The International Red Cross appointed Barton as their official representative to the US government. It would be her job to lobby the government to sign on to the Geneva Convention and officially establish a Red Cross chapter. Since previous attempts had been made to approach the US government directly, Barton planned to launch a publicity campaign, as few American people or politicians had any idea that the Red Cross or the Geneva Convention even existed, much less why it would be a good thing to join. To promote this cause, she once again took to the lecture circuit. In 1878, she met with then-President Rutherford B. Hayes, who expressed the opinion of most Americans at the time that the US would never again face a calamity like the Civil War, and an organization like the International Red Cross would never be needed. In 1881, the Grand Army of the Republic, a Union veterans organization, was important in lobbying Congress and the new president, James Garfield, to sign the Geneva Convention. There was concern the treaty wouldn't be signed when Garfield was assassinated later that year. Barton finally succeeded during the administration of President Chester Arthur, Garfield's successor, using the argument that the new American Red Cross could respond to crises other than war, such as natural disasters, like earthquakes, forest fires, and hurricanes. President Arthur then decided to put his support behind the Geneva Convention. The treaty was finally ratified in March of 1882. When the US signed the Geneva Convention, Barton was the key reason. Clara Barton was also established as the head of the American Red Cross, and that made her one of the first women to officially represent the US government to foreign governments. The Red Cross in its nature, its aims and purposes, and consequently its methods, is unlike any other organization in the country. It is an organization of physical action, of instantaneous action at the spur of the moment. It cannot await the ordinary deliberation of organized bodies if it would be of use to suffering humanity, Barton wrote to Congress. Barton and the Red Cross did important relief work for the victims of the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania in 1889. And this is important to note because the Red Cross was different from other aid organizations because they helped not just with war, but after natural disasters. Barton's Red Cross also helped with the Spanish-American War in 1898, the 1896 humanitarian crisis in the Ottoman Empire, and more. Of her work during the Spanish-American War, Barton said, "Cuba was a hard field, full of heartbreaking memories. It gave the first opportunity to test the cooperation between the government and its supplemental handmaiden, the Red Cross." Barton's last field operation as president of the American Red Cross was helping victims of the Galveston hurricane in 1900 down in Texas, where the organization established an orphanage for children. Barton stated that it is not in its past that the glories or benefits of the Red Cross lie, but in the possibilities it has created for the future, in the lessons it has taught, in the avenues to humane effort it has opened, that shall constitute a bulwark against the mighty woes sure to come sooner or later to all people and all nations. Barton was forced to resign as president of the American Red Cross in 1904 at the age of 83 due to disagreements with her male colleagues over leadership style. In 1905, Barton helped establish the National First Aid Association of America for the purpose of teaching the American public basic first aid. It is a deplorable weakness of a great people that they do not know how in an emergency to care for the injured, Barton said in a newspaper report. When first aid shall be the common knowledge of the people, it ought to make them safer, better off, and happier. In 1909, the National First Aid Association became a part of the Red Cross and is still a large part of what the Red Cross does today. It's largely thanks to Barton and the education and awareness she helped provide to the American people that general knowledge of first aid is so widespread, and that you'll find first aid kits just about everywhere, especially in public places. I know we have several here in the museum. Barton continued to live in her Glen Echo, Maryland home, which had also served as the Red Cross headquarters since 1897. Barton published the first volume of her autobiography in 1908, titled The Story of My Childhood. Unfortunately, she would not live to write the other volumes. On April 12, 1912, she died in her home at the age of 90. The cause of death was pneumonia. She was buried in her hometown of North Oxford, Massachusetts. Between her birth in 1821 and her death in 1912, Barton experienced firsthand and led important efforts to ensure the rise of international humanitarian law and the idea that there should be standards of decency even during wars. The groundwork laid out by Barton and her contemporaries still reverberates today, with countries seeking to lessen the horrors of war and natural disasters to the greatest extent possible. Clara Barton's legacy lives on not just in the continuing work of the Red Cross, but also through humanitarian movements worldwide, such as Chef Jose Andres and World Central Kitchen, an organization that provides meals for people in disaster areas such as the Ukraine. And you might have heard the recent news that several of these workers for World Central Kitchen were killed in the conflict over in the Middle East. Chef Andres cites Clara Barton as a key inspiration for his work, as he lived just across the street from Barton's boarding house in Washington, D.C., and was aware of what Barton had done there during the Civil War and afterwards. Barton was also a trailblazer for women in the medical field and a strong advocate for women's and civil rights. She was a true heroine and humanitarian. An editorial written in a local paper just after the Johnstown flood put it best. "We cannot thank Miss Barton in words. Hunt the dictionaries of all the languages, and you will not find the signs to express our appreciation of her and her work. Try to describe the sunshine. Try to describe the starlight. Words fail us." All right, any questions? One new message. Okay, let's see. We've got, oh, you get your,
I'm not sure if my audio is coming through very well, but I did push it.
it's all breaking up. I'm going to read your message here. Civil War Trails organization set up a market to the nurse Cornelia Hancock near Brandy Station Battlefield. She was rejected by Dorothea Dix to work as a nurse. Wondering specifically about Dix's claim younger women would not make good nurses. Did Dix likely believe this the case, or was she considering political implications to prove her nurses did not disappoint the male-dominated army, or something else? Did Clara Barton have similar opinions on younger women serving as nurses? It's my understanding that the reason that Dorothea Dix did not like younger women becoming nurses is she was afraid that they would be husband hunting in hospitals. And they would also be a large distraction to the men working in the hospital and to the soldiers who were patients in the hospitals. She didn't want any kind of hanky-panky going on. And that's my view of what she was talking about. It wasn't the fact that they were young and inexperienced. It was just the fact that they were young and a lot of times unmarried. And that's why she was also looking for women who she considered to be plain. She didn't want like ravishing beauties hanging out in the hospitals. Barton, as far as her opinion of younger women, I've not seen anything in her writings to say either way. I know she was grateful for the help of whoever she could get to assist her. And she visited with Susie King Taylor, who was a famous African American nurse down in South Carolina when Barton was down in South Carolina. Susie King Taylor was young at the time. Barton herself was not. She was older. But I don't think Barton herself had any kind of prejudice either way. Barton's opinion on the 15th Amendment and her disappointment women were not included in the amendment. Yeah, I don't really have an expertise in this particular area. I mean, I know she was at odds with some of the women, as I mentioned, the suffragettes, as I mentioned, about the trying to get women the right to vote. But I don't have any specific insights on this. I'm not so up on her politics as I am on her nursing stuff. Okay, the Red Cross was different because they provided support during natural disasters. So wondering what other support there was for natural disasters before the Red Cross. As far as I know, there was not any national organization available to provide support for natural disasters. It would all hinge on the local community coming out and taking care of the folks. And if the people in the local community were totally devastated, then they were in a lot of trouble. For example, the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania wiped out just about the entire town. So yeah, as far as I know, that there were not any other, it was just would have been local support, but not national support at all. Were there more examples than the one you mentioned when Clara did battlefield surgery on wounded soldiers? Yeah, she talks about assisting in amputations, especially at Antietam. And I guess Antietam was sort of her baptism by fire, no pun intended, for dealing directly with the wounded soldiers, and while the battle's still going on. And she does talk about assisting in amputations. I mean, as far as other battlefield surgeries, she wasn't really qualified to do anything more technical than taking a bullet out of a soldier's cheek. I wouldn't imagine she wouldn't have performed the amputations on her own. She would have been just assisting. Any other questions? Yes. Okay. Do you think her teaching style during her first career reflect on her leadership style later in her nursing career? Clara was a very confident woman, and a very she liked to be in charge, and I think that's one of the reasons why she didn't get along with Dorothea Dix, because Clara liked to be in charge of what she was doing. She didn't like anybody to tell her how to do things. She had in her head how she wanted it done. So I think maybe that's what a habit that she got into from teaching. I think that's quite possible. And at the beginning of her life, she was an extremely shy person, and that's why her parents suggested she go into teaching to overcome her shyness. She never really overcame the shyness. When she was on the lecture circuit, she'd get stage fright really, really bad, but she would always force herself to go out there and do it. And I just think that I would call her headstrong, but not in a bad way. She was really determined to do things right, determined in the way things she wanted to do things right were, her way. It wasn't her way or the highway, but she was just very determined. Thank you so much for the presentation. I have to head out, but this was so informative. Oh, thank you, Claire. Appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. And we'll be posting this. I'm recording this right now. We'll be posting this on our YouTube channel, so you can tune in to see if you miss anything else. But I think we're getting pretty much toward the ends of the questions. Oh, Aaron says, looking forward to sharing the link for recording with the students who missed this. Awesome. Yeah, and I'll have our video guy go through and do some like basic edits, and then I'll get it posted. I'll have them posted on YouTube. So it'll be posted next week at some point, and I will send Aaron the link, and then he can share with everybody. Thank you, Zachary. Appreciate you tuning in. Any other questions or anything? Okay, well, I thank you very much for your time. And if anybody's ever in Frederick, Maryland, please come and visit our main museum. We're on East Patrick Street. And also, tying in with this lecture, I'd like to encourage you to visit the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum that we operate in Washington, D.C. It's on 7th Street Northwest. If you ever find yourself going to a Caps game, you can come and check us out.
How much is the tickets for the museum, or is it free?
Our museum is it's $9.50 for adults, $8.50 for military or for students.
Okay.
And the same with the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks for joining us today, Alicia. And oh, great, Aaron says you're planning a field trip for summer break. Wonderful. All right, well, I look forward to seeing all of you, and thank you again.